We have a great panel for you, and they're coming out ahead of cue. So I'll introduce them all together. We're excited to talk about covering the president, covering this White House. First, on the end there, Jim Acosta, senior White House correspondent for CNN, spent 2016 covering the Trump administration, the Trump campaign during the primaries, the general election. He previously covered the Obama administration from the White House and around the world. He has been on the receiving end, obviously you may have noticed, of more Trump tweets and more than one heated exchange with the president. We will talk about that in our panel here. Julie Pace, Chief White House Correspondent for the Associated Press. Since the beginning of President Obama's second term, she joined the AP White House team in 2009 after covering Obama's 2008 campaign. And she has been churning out scoops with the AP ever since. She also serves as a board member of the White House Correspondents Association. Next, we have Charlie Spearing. He's the White House correspondent for Breitbart News. He came to Breitbart from the Washington Examiner in 2014, got his start in covering politics, working for conservative columnist Bob Novak. He started covering the White House during the Obama administration. Next, Kristen Welker. She's the White House correspondent for NBC News since 2011, can be seen frequently in the front row of the briefing room, going back and forth with the man you just saw up here, Sean Spicer, numerous times. Her reporting appears on all NBC and MSNBC platforms. She spent 2016 reporting from the trail of Hillary Clinton's campaign. And finally, Glenn Thrush, White House correspondent for the New York Times, has a long history going back to his days at New York's Newsday, covering and interviewing Donald Trump, has some history there. Just last week, he and his colleague Maggie Haberman conducted a headline-making interview in the Oval Office with the president. He joined the Times just a few months ago from Politico, where he was their chief political correspondent. So this is the panel. Let's give them one round of applause. All right, Glenn. So obviously the press briefings have been pretty interesting. The fact that you have a Saturday Night Live character already is a factor. But talk about covering this particular White House and the challenges in doing so.
By the way, I'd like to congratulate the Newseum. Whatever they put in Sean's coffee this morning, I think calmed things down considerably. I would recommend.
It was a little low tone,
I would definitely recommend that every day. Look,
do you really, Glenn?
I say this with great affection, of course. Look, I think the tone, and Jim and I were talking about this before we came on, the tone was set the day after the inauguration when Sean Spicer came out and decided to berate the media about the crowd size at the inaugural. And the thing about that, as bizarre as that wasn't the salient issue for me personally. My problem with that is he came in, shouted at everybody, and refused to take questions. And to me, that was a fundamental violation of the purpose of that room, which is not about questions, it's about answers. I think I've heard Sean in a lot of different venues, and I think he was, again, very subdued and contrite today. But I have seen a diminishment of that room over the last 3 months. I think the Obama administration had sought to cool it down after Robert Gibbs was the press secretary who'd make news from the podium with great regularity. I don't think President Obama really appreciated that. But I think what we have seen is we have seen a series of missteps. I think it is entirely appropriate and unbiased to say that the level of information and the quality of information we're receiving during these briefings is, I believe, not up to the standard of what we believe ought to be in the briefing room. So I think in terms of, I would put this out for Mr. Spicer and his staff. We have been on the receiving end many times of lectures about what we need to do professionally in terms of dealing with our process. I would encourage him and the communication staff of the White House to do the same.
Julie, let me just ask you, when I was White House correspondent, a lot of the information came from outside the White House. Same logistics?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think you learn when you cover the White House over time is that there's information that you get from inside the building, but the information you're really after often comes from outside the building. And it was something that took me a while to grasp when I first started covering the beat. And it was actually coming back to the beat this year, after being off on the campaign most of last year. Two of my sort of resolutions for the beat were to go to the briefing less and to spend more time outside of the White House. And you find that you just, I think, get a lot more depth in your coverage when you're talking not just to the communication shop or the policy shop at the White House, but to who's talking to them on Capitol Hill, who's talking to them in the lobbying world. And one of the great things about covering President Trump is that he talks to a ton of people, the traditional people in Washington that you would expect him to, but also this really wide range of people who are his friends and associates from New York, from Mar-a-Lago, from his business world. So as reporters, I think it actually gives us this great advantage to not just get to know the people who are surrounding him every day inside the White House, but to really get perspective about him from outside.
Kirsten?
I agree with everything Julie's saying. I think that some of the best information and insight that I've gotten into this president comes from his friends who don't necessarily live in D.C. I think one of the things that makes covering this White House really striking is the sheer amount of energy that this president has, and that sort of requires, I think, a 24/7 news cycle in a way that is on a whole new level. He's tweeting at 6 a.m., he's tweeting at 11 p.m., and we are often reporting out our stories overnight. I mean, literally until midnight, 1 a.m. in the morning. And I think that you always have to be prepared when you're walking around that White House, because obviously he sometimes invites reporters into the Oval Office. I was invited in for an impromptu meeting with him. And so you always have to sort of be on your toes to make sure that you're, getting the best information, pushing the headlines forward.
Jim, I mentioned some of that back and forth. Has that evolved since that first exchange and those early tweets?
I have not been invited into any private meetings with the president at the White House. Perhaps you could have figured that out. We had that news conference where he and I had that back and forth back in January, which, by the way, was the only news conference during the transition. We should remember that. The president-elect only had one news conference. It was on January 11th. But 9 days later, during the inauguration, I was positioned on the north lawn of the White House, right in the middle. President and First Lady walked right past me, and I threw a question at him, and he answered it. So I think, to some extent, the president knows, he knows television. And, he is not going to miss a moment if it's going to serve his purpose. And I think, to some extent, that's what happened on January 11th. He and I had this back and forth. And just to quickly go over that, my feeling is that our news organization was being attacked on that day. We were being called fake news and so forth. And I felt that I deserved, and our organization deserved, a question to challenge him on what was being reported at that time, which is this idea that the Trump campaign was having contacts with Russian officials, Russian intelligence operatives, perhaps, during the campaign. And so, things have evolved since then. You'll notice there was that one news conference where he and I went back and forth for some 8 minutes, and he asked me if I was related somehow to Alexander Acosta, who's going to be the labor secretary. So I think to some extent, that did happen. You can go back and look at the tape. So I think to some extent he enjoys the sparring back and forth. And the one thing I do want to say is, and we'll probably have time to talk about all of this, is that, we're told that we live in this nothing matters world, or we're in this post-truth world. I think that couldn't be further from the truth. I think now more than ever, speaking truth to power means everything. And so I think that is what I was trying to do on that day back in January, and I think that's what we at CNN, and I think my colleagues here, try to do every day.
Would you do it the same way again?
I would, yeah. I would do it the same way again. If our news organization is being attacked, my sense is that cannot go without any kind of response. And really quickly, that night, I heard from a news executive from another network who said, "Hey, you did a really great job today defending your network." And I said, I texted back to him, I said, "I was defending all of us, because it could be your network tomorrow."
Charlie, you covered in the Obama administration inside the White House. You came from the Washington Examiner to Breitbart. Breitbart is obviously a different organization in that you have previous ties with somebody who's inside the White House, Steve Bannon. You have to kind of separate that, I suppose, in how you cover the White House. Talk about the unique challenges for you.
Well, absolutely. And during the campaign, you know, the president made a lot of promises to our readers, to conservatives in general. He made a lot of promises that, you know, we at Breitbart feel it's important to hold him accountable to those promises. He talked a lot about immigration. He talked a lot about building a wall. He talked a lot about helping our vets. He made a very long list of promises, and we were one of the conservative outlets that, you know, took him at his word and really you just sort of published everything that he said as it was. We didn't, you know, suggest that maybe he was lying or fake on these issues. And I think so we have a bigger responsibility to tackle his work here and hold him accountable to the promises he made to our readers.
So is it unique, this White House, in trying to get information for you? Do you have more access?
Yeah, that's really funny because the frustrating part, I think, is when readers or when people read the Breitbart News website and just assume that everything is coming from a Steve Bannon dispatch. I certainly don't get phone calls from him. He's now a source, and he's pretty much a useless source in many cases. He probably talks to the New York Times and other outlets more than he talks to Breitbart News. But I feel like, you know, Steve Bannon is pretty open on who he is, and certainly we're going to cover him as a member of the White House, and we're not going, if he strays from anything that, you know, our readers believe in, we're definitely going to hold him accountable.
You heard Sean Glenn talk about the coverage of policy and policy decisions versus the process. And here in Washington, obviously, we get a lot of behind the scenes about who's up and who's down and what's going to happen. And there could be many things that happen inside this White House very soon, personnel-wise. How do you balance out that as far as coverage?
Well, first of all, I dispute the notion that process isn't policy. Process is policy. And I think that really manifested itself very clearly in the whole, and Sean first started making the argument, if I'm not mistaken, most forcefully having to do with the Devin Nunes midnight visit to the campus of the White House, where he kept saying, as we were asking questions, really important questions about who Nunes was meeting, who authorized those meetings, did the president know about these things? Sean would reduce that to us asking questions about how people were dressed, right? What gate they came in. So it behooves him, from his perspective as being a flack, to make a differentiation between process and policy. But I will tell you, I started off my career, as crazy as this might sound, in policy. I ran think tanks, and I covered poverty in New York City for 5 or 6 years, and it's been an interest of mine for a long time. I would like to engage members of this administration in serious policy discussions, and I find it difficult sometimes to find people to engage at that level. So I think, in general, the process with this particular administration is important because they have violated issues of process, and in some instances, I believe they don't fully understand what the appropriate process is.
Were you surprised when the president called and has done interviews with Maggie and you and picked up the phone and called?
No, and I think he gets props for this. I think this is, to me, something I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for. You know, it was funny, again, Maggie Haberman, my colleague, and I, and a bunch of other people who cover the White House right now, come out of the crucible of New York City Hall. And I've said often that this is, to me, having covered the Obama administration tail end of the Bush administration, this seems almost more like a national mayoralty than a White House. And covering Rudolph Giuliani and Ed Koch was not dissimilar. So when he had that amazing press conference, his first press conference as president, a lot of my colleagues who had covered sort of the White House as the White House were like, what the hell is this, right? And I was like, this is an Ed Koch 1987 press conference. And I think he gets a lot of credit for that. Remember, Barack Obama, we talk about how Trump is cracking down on the press. Barack Obama had a neat little piece of white, 8.5 by 11, and he had the names of 6 or 7 reporters that he was going to call on, and he never diverged from that. And you'd ask him a 30-second question, and I recall once being in Charlotte where he was asked this in a forum, and he gave a 28-minute answer, much like I'm giving right now, by the way.
It's okay. We have plenty of time.
But I mean, but I think in general, he is much more willing to engage people, and I think he deserves enormous credit for that.
What about access? I mean, do you see that, Kirsten?
Well, I think that Glenn is right. There's this perception that our access is being taken away. The reality is, because the president does reach out to reporters at times directly, in that sense, he sort of differentiates himself. I mean, I've never experienced that, in the 5 years that I covered the Obama administration. At the same time, I think the challenge becomes trying to delve more deeply into some of the policy issues, trying to get direct answers to our questions. And you talk about the issue of process, and that really speaks in some instances to the very underpinnings of the White House itself. I mean, we've been following this back and forth, for example, between Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner. And the reason why that type of a back and forth matters is because you look at the debate over Syria, for example. We know that that's something that Bannon, someone who considers himself as a nationalist, doesn't necessarily support. So that's why those types of discussions matter and go beyond just process. And that's why I think it becomes, to some extent, dangerous to downplay the significance of it.
Yeah, listen, I'm a guy who covers process, and I get that. I was just going off of the Sean Spicer comment as he was leaving with Greta. Jim, I want to talk to you about the campaign and if that factors into your mind about how to cover the White House, because a lot of us missed a lot of what was happening on the campaign. And didn't see it at the very end that it was going to happen. And does that factor into how you cover the White House now?
I think it does. And one of my regrets from the campaign is I did not take our anchors out with us out on the campaign trail, or some of our executives out on the campaign trail. And, and perhaps I have a little post-campaign stress disorder. But, President, you were talking about access. I'm not sure access is the issue so much as it is attitude towards the news media. And the president, to some extent, has an unhealthy attitude towards the news media, and I think I'm being diplomatic when I say this. I was out on the campaign trail time and again when he referred to the news media as the dishonest news media, the disgusting news media. He called us liars and crooks and thieves, and I can't think of all the other names that he called us. There were chants of, going after CNN that he would pause for and allow the crowd to continue those chants. And, I did ask him during that news conference where he did take my question, are you concerned that you were undermining American confidence in the news media? Because at the end of the day, when he leaves office, we need Republicans to believe what's being said in the mainstream news media just as much as we need Democrats to. And I think that the president has to understand that he is doing real damage to what we do. He's doing real damage to the First Amendment in this country when he refers to the news media as the enemies of the people. Now, I know some of that is production. It's, he's from Fifth Avenue, so there's a little bit of Broadway there, I guess, or something like that. Maybe Glenn has more insights to that than I do. But I think words matter, and those kinds of attacks have to be taken seriously. I've talked to people inside the administration, why can't the president lay off of some of this fake news and enemies of the people stuff? And they say, well, what are you guys doing? And they sort of throw it back in your face. I think at some point we're going to need a, détente between this administration and the news media, or else it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. We need people to trust us, and I think that we have been acting in a way that garners that trust. But the president doesn't like bad stories about him, and this is how he responds, and we've got to figure out a way around it.
Well, I think what's so striking is that there's the public perception, the public comments the president makes, and then what actually happens behind the scenes. And I think most of us would agree we have pretty good working relationships with Trump officials. I think it's so critical to underscore the point, though, it's not just about the back and forth between the media and the president. It's about protecting our democracy and the point that Jim makes about our First Amendment. And so I think that sometimes that gets lost in the public debate, that it becomes a fight between two sides, the press versus the president, and that's not at all what the debate is about. It's about making sure that we're protecting the First Amendment.
Julie, in the campaign, there was always this talk, well, this is where he's going to turn. This is where he's going to be different. Do you sense that that President Trump is going to somehow evolve in the way he handles some of this? Or do you think it's who he is?
It's who he is. I mean, there are things about Trump. He's a 70-year-old man who has lived in the spotlight for decades. There are things about him that are never going to change. And we shouldn't keep expecting that that's going to happen because he moves on to a new phase of his political career. At the same time, I do think that you are seeing a process inside the White House where they are, I don't know if they're fully accepting at this point, but they are learning that you do get treated differently as president. You know, Trump has these long relationships with the media that come from being on reality television, that come from being in the business world, that come from having these relationships with the kind of gossip pages in New York tabloids. That's different than how you get covered as president. You are held to different standards, and that's okay. And I think that that has been a learning curve for them. Sometimes I am surprised when I hear from White House officials about what actually bothers Trump in his coverage. Often it's not that stories are negative, it's the tone that a question was asked with that bothers him. It's this feeling that he doesn't have the relationships with the Washington press corps that he maybe had with the New York press corps. But it's not necessarily that the headline was wrong or that the policy context was missed in it. I find that striking. But if you're waiting for a policy evolution or a personality evolution with Trump, you know, get over it. It's not going to happen.
Get over it. Charlie, does the Syria strike change the dynamic, and how is it received at your organization?
Well, certainly the Syria strike was kind of a surprise for a lot of our readers, but I think that we covered it, and yet, you know, in a way that made sense and focusing how it was a little different than the America First sort of campaign message that he shared. But, you know, I think in hindsight, and, you know, the president even said, you know, reassured people who were concerned about our foreign policy, he reassured them that we're not going into Syria. And if I just want to mention, refer to his comments about the media, the president made these comments about the media and the biased media and the fake news, mostly because he didn't do it to sort of denigrate the press. He did it because it was popular among his base. His base loved those applause lines. His base has a real problem with the way the media is perceived. And I think that he was, in a large way, playing to the crowd on this one, and something that conservatives have complained about for a long time.
But do you think that he has gotten to the point where he knows he's the president, he won, he doesn't have to keep going back to the election, to the campaign's over? I mean, do you sense that? No. But do you sense that he's fighting that PR battle still day to day?
Well, we have an armada off, what he calls an armada off the coast of North Korea, so I certainly hope he does. Look, I think Charlie is 100% right on the whole issue of it being something that works with the crowd. You know, Trump refers to people as customers, and I think he views it as a different mindset than we have had for a president ever. And I think it's fascinating because we think of him, and he sold himself to the base as being a businessman. What he in fact is a salesman. And having covered New York real estate, I can tell you got to sell the hell out of that stuff. So he is somebody, I think, who has a remarkably sophisticated ear for the electorate that he was able to win over. So he understands his capacity to sort of calibrate the kinds of this balancing act that Charlie was describing between what the base wants and what the necessities of the presidency demand. To me, that is probably the most interesting dynamic in him. How does he reconcile what he has to do with the base versus what he has to do with president? And thus far, up to this point, before the Syria thing, he's punted on it. That's why the Syria thing is such a crucible.
Right. I mean, he does like to be liked. I mean, we have to put that out there. And the fact that this Syria strike, Kristen, was well received on the left and the right, largely, and he was getting props from senators who don't usually give him props. Does that somehow, do you think, change his outlook on how he's going to deal with foreign policy decisions going forward?
Possibly. I think he's the first person to tell you that he's gotten broad bipartisan support for this strike. I think you're absolutely right about that. And it was a real turning point, by the way, for him, because he'd had a number of rocky weeks and days sort of leading up to that. a lot of people saw that as his the moment when he really started to absorb those responsibilities as president. And based on my conversations with administration officials, they have acknowledged that there is a transition going on within him, that he's starting to realize that everything that worked on the campaign trail doesn't necessarily work in the White House. And I think that the Syria strike was emblematic of that, certainly. I think the fact that it was limited, that it was very calibrated, specific, speaks to sort of his internal conflict with engaging in some of these foreign situations. But absolutely, I think you're starting to see a shift in that regard, absorbing some of these responsibilities. I don't think he's ever going to change who he is, but I think that he's starting to accept some of the reality of being commander-in-chief and what that holds.
Julian?
But I think this is important for people to know about Trump. His interest in knowing the real-time reaction to his decisions is so unique. In presidents that I've covered in the past, they are aware of their polling, they are aware generally of how they're being perceived, but Trump wants to know minute to minute how a decision is being received. He watches it on television, he reads it in the papers. And when you talk to some Republicans, this actually worries them a bit, because he is going to find himself in position as president to have to make a decision that he and his advisors believe is right, but they know is going to be unpopular. It's inevitable, it will happen. And where does he fall on that? Does he have the capacity to make the decision that is the right one, even though the short-term reaction is going to be negative? Can he deal with that and handle that? It leaves people nervous, especially on foreign policy, when the actual outcome of a decision isn't really known sometimes for years.
Well, that's
Yeah,
what.
and I was going to say that, if you look back at the president's tweets, from 2013, where he was saying to President Obama, don't go into Syria, I think the Syria strike is an indication that he can change. He can change his mind on something, and that's not such a bad thing when you're president of the United States. You sometimes have to stop the campaigning and start the governing. And my understanding is, from talking to administration officials, is that he was deeply affected by the images of those children after they were gassed. And, you have to give credit where credit is due. I'm not saying that, that this is going to be the best policy decision moving forward down the road. But when you have the kind of unanimity that we've had here in Washington over the last week, that a war crime should be responded to, and perhaps in a proportional way, in a measured way, that on balance, it seems he made the right decision here.
But there's no sense that he's going to change the tweeting.
No, no. Live by the tweet, die by the tweet. He hasn't died. He hasn't died yet. I do wonder. At some point, I would love to talk to him at the end of his administration, whether it's in 4 years. I'm sure he would love it to be in 8 years. What he thinks about these tweets, because honestly, they've gotten him in so much trouble. This issue of tweeting that President Obama wiretapped him. Going back to what Glenn was saying earlier about being in the briefing room and watching Spicer, one of the most excruciating things that we've had to watch over the last few weeks is the White House trying to explain and justify the president's tweet, which is a misstatement of the facts, that President Obama did not wiretap Trump Tower, did not wiretap. And they said, well, we're talking about surveillance, it's a surveillance thing. And now, CNN is reporting that by talking to folks on both sides of the aisle on the intelligence committees and their staffers, that no, that the intelligence tells us at this point there wasn't even any unlawful surveillance going on, and that Susan Rice didn't do anything wrong or conduct herself in an unlawful way. And so, these verbal gymnastics that Sean, I can understand why yesterday happened. The exhaustion, the level of exhaustion he must be feeling right now, having to deal with this president who is just sort of unwielding and difficult to corral, it must be a pretty draining experience.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you wake up and you see a tweet that changes your entire day, that's interesting, in 140 characters or less. But just talk about that for a second, about covering a president who has his own printing press, who, it's a unique thing. Anybody?
Oh, I just wanted to mention, I think what upsets a lot of our readers is when you hear people when you hear the media being so willing to exonerate Susan Rice, as Jim just did, And, they take a completely hostile tone towards the president, but when it comes to people like Susan Rice, they're not taking the same tone of hostility. And a lot of the news that they publish on that, I think a lot of our readers see that as sort of coming from one side. This is why our readers are so comfortable with the president describing the media as the opposition party. They're getting most of their talking points, a good portion of their sources from their Democratic friends. They didn't vote for the president. They don't know too many of the president's supporters. And I think that, I think there is a difference in tone coming from the mainstream media versus Breitbart.
But Charlie, do you think when you say that I just let Susan Rice off the hook, I didn't let Susan Rice off the hook. You can go back and watch an interview I did with Susan Rice a couple years ago where I didn't let her off the hook. But let me ask you this. When the president originally tweeted that Barack Obama wiretapped me at Trump Tower, it's like McCarthy, it's like Watergate. Do you think in the back of his mind he was thinking, oh yeah, Susan Rice, she unmasked some people, and that's what I really meant when I tweeted that. It just seems to me, over the last few weeks, the White House has been sort of fumbling around in the dark in search of a justification for these tweets that were just totally erroneous. And my question has always been, why doesn't the president just withdraw the tweet, retract the accusation? We just have not gotten to that point yet. And my question, my question is, why can't the folks on the conservative side of the news media, just see the facts as they are? I mean, don't you agree, Charlie, that those tweets on their face are just wrong? The president was not wiretapped at Trump Tower by Barack Obama.
Well, I think that there's a certain element of truth that comes from his tweets, and he was basing his tweets on a lot of
We're not talking about an element of truth. How about just the truth? Why can't we just have the truth? That's my question. And as much as people want to beat up on CNN and go after CNN and CNN sucks and that sort of thing, which your readers do and your side of the aisle does. I was with Steve Bannon the other day where he referred to us as the opposition party once again. We're not the opposition party. We are just trying to get at the truth. And when you have a side of the news media that just insists time and again that that CNN is out to get the president or out to get certain people in this country, I think it just does a tremendous disservice to all Americans. I don't think it is American to go after a segment of the news media. Brett knows because Brett is a pro who does a great newscast every night on Fox News. I watch it all the time when I'm not watching Wolf Blitzer.
You can DVR us.
But I can DVR you, and I probably have. But listen, we have got to get to a point in this country where we're not demonizing one another and going after each other and cutting each other's throats because we don't agree with one another. I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to play to the audience here. I grew up in this city, and I do, and people talk about, oh, remember the days of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. That actually did exist, and so we just have to, and Brett and I are very friendly with each other, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Carl Cameron and John Roberts, my Fox News colleagues out on the campaign trail. And I just, I'd love for all of us to get away from this day where we're just ripping each other apart because of political differences. I think good people can disagree on the issues, and it's time for good people to disagree in a civil way about how the news is covered in this country. And I'd love it to start down the street of Pennsylvania Avenue, and I'd love to see it at places like Breitbart, and perhaps our folks can do a better job at that as well.
Well, I think those sort of the go along, get along, everyone gets along climate in Washington, D.C. is what Americans are tired of. They're tired of the closeness of the news media with the officials they cover. They're tired of the stories of everybody hanging out, going out to dinners and partying, and they're tired of their issues.
That happens with Republicans and Democrats, too, to be fair. I mean, it's not as though reporters are hanging out with only Democrats. We have dinners and lunches and coffees with Republicans as well.
Right, but it's part of the establishment. It's part of the swamp that, the Trump supporters were very sick of.
Charlie,
the campaign is over.
The one thing I will say is the best party I've been to in the last year was the Daily Caller Christmas party. So.
There you go.
I do original question, though, Brett, about the president and his tweets. I think that it creates a climate where the media is even more important because the president has a platform, as President Obama did. President Obama was very effective at trying to go around the media using Twitter, Facebook, White House produced videos, and present their side of the story. And we probably could have been more aggressive as a press in recognizing what was happening and making sure that we were instantly coming in with fact checks, instantly coming in with information to try to bolster what the actual facts were, not just what the White House spin was. I think we've stepped up and done a better job of that under President Trump. I think we will continue to do that. But that doesn't happen without the press. The facts that get added on to the tweets, the context that gets added on to the wiretapping tweets, that doesn't happen without us. We play an incredibly vital role even when you have a president that has a huge platform to go around us.
Glenn?
Yeah, I just want to throw just 2 data points in the context for this entire conversation. He's the least popular president at this point in his presidency in modern polling history. We've seen a couple of reputable polls in the last couple of weeks that have him at 35 to 37%. Real Clear Politics in the aggregate has him at 40 to 41%. At the very best, Rasmussen and those guys have him peaking occasionally above 50%. These are abysmal numbers. There's no honeymoon. So, and one of the things when you hear focus groups, Democratic and Republican focus groups, principally Republican focus groups, those are the people I talked to lately, they will tell you that almost uniformly, even his supporters want him to tweet less, right? It is an incredibly powerful tool if he is able to evolve. And we actually, in the wake, I know it is a subtle difference, but in the wake of the wiretap, the infamous wiretap Saturday morning tweet, he has chilled it out a little bit and has used his account more strategically. This, I think, is the overarching question of the presidency, and it's a question, I think, that will manifest itself in his Twitter account first, right? And that is, it has been my experience and the experience of a lot of historians that no matter how singular the president is, the presidency shapes the president, not the other way around. And I want to see how he evolves. Now, he's not going to do what Sean Spicer did up here and apologize. It's not the guy's style. But his contrition is cloaked. What I want to see over time, and I think we have seen it in terms of the personnel roster of the West Wing, we have seen, and Charlie knows this because his readers are probably hating it, but we have seen a quote-unquote, I hate this word, normalization of the staffing of the White House. We now have a national security advisor who was essentially handpicked by Senator Cotton from Arkansas, McMaster, who was a conventional choice with a lot of very conventional, somewhat militaristic, mainstream old-time Republican views. You have Mattis in the same mold. You have Steve Bannon, whether he's your source or not, perhaps being moved to the margins. I thought it was extraordinary yesterday, for those of you who didn't see it, the president telling the New York Post that he's only known Bannon for a weekend, right? Yeah, if that's not writing, I mean, that's spray paint on the wall.
Yeah, that's right.
So, you know, so the
And
point is...
Tillerson, picked essentially by
Tillerson.
Gates and Condi Rice
who
and
speaks.
others.
He's like Garbo. He's chattering willy-nilly over the past 48 hours. It's nuts. And everything he says is in complete variance to what Donald Trump said in the campaign in terms of foreign policy, which is also, now we know perhaps why he wasn't speaking. So the point being is, for your readership, and your readership is the core of this man's support, this White House is moving in a much more conventional way. So if you just kind of look at the outputs and the personnel movement at this point in time, you could say we've had 3 months of shakedown, and this is moving in a fairly conventional Republican direction. I don't want to overstate that because he's a really unpredictable guy, but I think things are moving in that direction.
You want to say something?
And I think that's absolutely right. I think that in terms of the tweets, this is the way that the president feels he can have a direct channel to the American people. And I was talking to one of his top officials who said, look, one of the reasons why he reaches out to individual reporters is because he feels like it's the only way he can be heard and cut through all of the noise. That's not to excuse some of the disinformation that Jim describes, but I think that's what we're seeing and why he will never give up Twitter. I can't underscore this point enough. Julie and I covered the Obama administration. We did have fights with them over access, things as small as what would to the general public seem small, to us was a very big deal, not letting our cameras in to shoot a meeting that he was having. We would have a knockdown, drag-out fight sometimes with the Obama administration about that because of this very issue, because yes, it's important for the president to have a direct line to the American public, but it's important for the press to be a part of that process as well. And so I don't think you're going to see him ever give up tweeting. His tweets have, to Glenn's point, been, I think, more policy-based to some extent, particularly in the wake of Syria and dealing with North Korea as well. So I don't think we're ever going to see him give that up, but I do think it's going to be kind of an ongoing debate about more press access.
I would like to point out that he has done, I think it's 8 interviews, 6 of them with Fox News Channel overall. But I would point out that my request and Chris Wallace's request and Shannon Bream's request, Bill Hemmer's request, Martha McCallum's request, we're still waiting to.
So are ours, Brett. Yeah.
And I know,
Yeah.
Jim, yours are still pending too.
If you could put in a good word for us.
Yeah, there you go.
I think just one more
Maybe
point.
you can with me.
One more
no.
point about the Twitter, though, that I think is important. I think we have a responsibility as the press to not throw up every tweet on air in real time, to sort of process what is in the tweet, what does it mean, to fact check it. And I think that we are having those types of discussions in our newsrooms, how to better do that, how to better achieve that.
Julie, what's something that we're not covering enough from a White House point of view or a White House-Congress relationship point of view?
I think there's actually kind of a long list of things. I mean, frankly, if you look at a situation like North Korea, which is getting covered on a daily basis in terms of the president is warning China or they're moving, these number of ships into the region. The North Korea story is massive, and that is one that could potentially shape the entire direction of his presidency. And beyond warning China that he'll act alone, I don't think we have a great sense of what he's willing to do there. And the consequences for the US, for the region, for key allies in Asia, I think could demand a lot more of our attention. I also think that just in terms of his relationship with Congress, this is a political story, not a policy story, but I'm fascinated where Trump is going to end up in 2018 when we end up in an election year. And he has this really complex relationship with his own party. He wants the party to be behind him, but he doesn't feel beholden to the party. Do we start seeing Trump and his campaign organization, which still exists, going out and primarying people? Are they going to start raising money for primary challengers to people who aren't with him or weren't with him on healthcare, maybe aren't with him on tax reform? And the idea of a President Trump without a fairly united Republican Party behind him for his last two years of this term, I think is fascinating as well. So that political dynamic, I think, is something we should start focusing on as well.
Yeah. Jim, your thoughts about what we're not covering enough?
You have to give the president credit. During the campaign, he tapped into something that nobody saw coming, which is this idea, and it's a real thing, of the forgotten American. People who live in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, folks who have been living in these towns where the factory was shut down. And, for 8 years under the Obama administration, they just did not address this issue. People, yes, the unemployment rate was going down, but there are people on the margins who were just suffering and trying to figure out, how am I going to put food on the table, get my kid to college? And President Trump tapped into that. Now, some people might say, and I do think there's some truth to this, in that he put some divisions out there. He was dividing and conquering to some extent by blaming, well, it's because of the Mexicans who are coming across the border and taking your job, and so forth and so on. But I think that is a real issue. And I think it would be great for reporters to go back to some of these towns and find out what is happening to those people. And are they waiting for President Trump to come in with some policies? I think what we did find out was a lot of those folks are on Obamacare. And, you saw that flare up at the town halls. I think one other issue that I'm fascinated by, that I want to just see covered over and over and over again, if he says he's going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, by golly, I want cameras on that border. We got to see if that wall's ever going to be built. And, he has to be held accountable if that was just a campaign device, which Newt Gingrich called it, that it was just really being used to get votes. Are we going to see a wall on the border? That is one of the biggest stories that I want to see covered over the next 4 years.
Charlie.
And it's no surprise, I agree with Jim on that.
Yeah.
Our readers certainly care about, the wall and whether or not Trump will actually build the wall. Heck, you just even have to start it and our readers would be happy. Just put one brick on top of the other.
A
but
1 mile
really-
stretch might be enough.
Yeah, get it started. Maybe the future president will finish the job.
Right.
But I think Jim's absolutely right. Like, I think we in the media tend to focus too much on foreign policy because and we saw this during the Syria and the missiles launches in Syria. I think you had a lot of reporters that just sort of got obsessed with the glamorization of going to war overseas, and talking about the beautiful missiles. And I think that it was such a positive experience for President Trump. Why would he think twice about launching another attack on foreign soil? It seems like we in the media are too comfortable with him acting overseas and don't question him enough on this. And I really think that for the media needs to focus more on domestic policy. So many lists don't even include creating jobs, enforcing the border, helping our vets. These are the things that resonated with all Americans. This is why Trump won the election. And I think he needs to remember that and focus entirely on that agenda. And granted, if stuff happens overseas and he wants to act tough and make America strong again, and if he wants to defeat ISIS, I think the American people will have a limited amount of support of that, but I think that the priority should remain squarely on the United States of America.
Interesting that, speaking of domestic politics, yesterday he said that he wants to go at health care again and get that done first before tax reform, and the relationship with Congress, the fact that getting a legislative strategy to be able to get from point A to point B seems to be where they haven't lined that up as of yet.
I was just going to bring up health care. This was one of his signature campaign promises. The White House moved on rather quickly. They sort of made an attempt to revive it, and then we moved on very quickly from that. And I think we need to resist the pull to move on quickly from one of his signature campaign promises. He vowed to repeal and replace Obamacare. This is something that a lot of his supporters still want to see him get done. The question is, how does he do that at this point? And are these efforts to revive it real? Are they genuine? And then within that context, some of his other big promises on taxes, on infrastructure, by the way, which might be the one point of bipartisan agreement that there needs to be some type of infrastructure overhaul in this country. So I think you're right. While we're covering all these other juicy headlines, it's so important and critical to remember what he actually promised his supporters. I also think it's critical that we continue to track the way in which his family sort of interacts, plays a role in this White House. It's unprecedented, the fact that you have his daughter and his son-in-law as his top advisors. This is really something that we've never seen. It makes his White House distinct, but there are some questions that I think have already been raised and will continue to get raised along the way.
At the risk of doing reporting from the stage, I think listening to Charlie talk about the notion, the prospect of having Breitbart holding President Trump accountable for his campaign promises, to me, is fantastic. And I think represents, to me, it's why I love media. And by the way, I'm the exact opposite of Trump on this. I love reporters of all stripes working for all organizations. I feel that, the lowliest reporter is morally superior to the most exalted flack. That is my sense. And the notion of the conservative media, the ideological media, holding a president that they helped elect accountable, to me, is the ultimate validation of the way that the system is supposed to work. I just think it's awesome. The other thing is, now, here's the reporting from the stage thing. Talking about, as Kristen was talking about, the family, this split between Jared Kushner and Ivanka and Bannon. Here's why the president can't let Bannon get too far out of the tent. Do you want Steve Bannon in the White House working with you, or do you want him outside of the White House holding the president accountable and reminding everybody that the guy that he got elected isn't fulfilling these campaign promises, that he's turning into, the third Bush presidency, right? That would be enormously damaging. And the core of support that the president still enjoys to a great degree has been consolidated as a result of Bannon and the coordination between that group and himself. And the thing I think is very interesting, and I guess this is getting a little inside baseball, is watching the Rebecca Mercer and the Mercer family, who is a big Republican donor, has an involvement in Breitbart. Watching the daylight between them and their agenda and what the Trump White House agenda is, I think is going to be one of the most important spaces to watch over the next couple of months.
I think you're exactly right. And whether Bannon stays in the White House or not, you know, he does have that whiteboard with all of the promises that candidate Trump made in his office inside the White House. And that that whiteboard is easily transferable to an online presence that is just hammering them every day. Julie, let's wrap up here and talk about covering the White House going forward. Are you disappointed about the White House Correspondents' Dinner? You're on the board. What's the reaction there?
Way to go.
Thank you. Look, we as a board invited the president, we invited the vice president, we invited the White House staff. I think that there is a lot about the dinner that could change and is changing, and that's positive. But I do think that it's all, you know, Charlie made the point that there's a lot of coziness between reporters and sources. Yes, that happens to some extent, but I also think one thing that is nice about the dinner is it is an opportunity for our sources to come to a dinner that celebrates the press and, you know, show that they respect us, that they respect the First Amendment, that they respect our role in this democracy. And this White House is choosing not to do that. And we wish that they would come. I think that it would be good for everybody to get in the same room together and celebrate the First Amendment. I think that our invitation is still open to them at this point. But, you know, to make our entire relationship with the Trump administration about the dinner, I think also would be to overstate it.
Maybe a late addition?
The invitation still
swooping in?
stands. The
Okay.
invitation still stands.
All right, your thoughts, Kristen?
Well, one of the things I think it's important to remember about the dinner, and I want to stress the invitation stands as well, even though I'm not on the board, but I think we would all really welcome it if he would come and if the White House staffers would come. But we're also raising money for future journalists. And that scholarship money, I think, is something that we all take very seriously. And the fact that we are sort of paying it forward, if you will, and I think that's one of the disappointing aspects about them not attending.
How big is the 100 days, and how big will it be lifted up as far as a marker, Jim, for this administration?
I was going to tell my story about how Donald Trump came by our table at the Correspondents' Dinner a couple of years ago and said, hey, good table. But anyway, that did happen.
Times have changed.
Times have changed, yes. And we're running out of time, so I won't go any further. No, you know, I think the 100-day marker is extremely important. I think they're obviously very conscious of this inside the White House. I think the president would desperately love to see some wins up on the scoreboard. I will tell you, and it's going to, I guess, sound a little crass having just said what I said, but, you know, I did talk to a senior White House official over the weekend who said, you know, hey, we feel really good about the way this last week has gone, referring to the Syria operation. You know, whether you want to call a military strike a win on the scoreboard, I think is maybe not the best way of putting it. But at this point, it is really the only thing that they can point to.
Well, Neil Gorsuch.
Neil Gorsuch, obviously, but it took the nuclear option to get that done, which is, I think, an indictment of our political system here. He's on the Supreme Court, but I think isn't that somewhat of an indictment of our political system that Neil Gorsuch, who was a very well-qualified, yes, conservative, but certainly not objectionable from a constitutional standpoint, from a scandal standpoint, that it took the nuclear option to put him on the Supreme Court. I think that just goes to show you that the partisan bickering and brinksmanship in this town is just not something that we're going to see depart the scene anytime soon. But healthcare didn't get done. The travel ban got tied up in the courts. And my sense of it is that the way they came into this administration, the way they were campaigning, and that is to just tear everything apart, smash things, and show everybody who's in charge, that they're the new sheriff in town. And I think previous administrations have had this problem, where things are not thought through. And I think in hindsight, had they done something that would have had more bipartisan appeal at the beginning of the administration, they probably find themselves in a better place. They probably would not have needed the nuclear option to get Neil Gorsuch confirmed. But we're in this permanent campaign. The phrase "the permanent campaign" is something that predates this administration, but it's where we are today. And I think Republicans will look at the 100-day mark and say Donald Trump has done a pretty good job. The other side will say, where are the wins on the scoreboard? And I think that's where we're going to be.
I'm not sure there was a bipartisan atmosphere on the Democratic side after this election, and
Oh, not at
Chuck
all, no.
Schumer would have
Right.
moved suddenly and done something differently.
But had he put the ball in their court and said, let's do infrastructure first, had he surprised people, had he not come out and said my inauguration size was bigger than Barack Obama's inauguration size, and had he not tried to put a travel ban in on 7 majority Muslim countries right away and repealed Obamacare and said Obama had wiretapped me over at Trump Tower, had he not done all those things and tried a more bipartisan tone, that's what people wanted after this election.
Is it what your readers would have wanted?
Well, I mean, you talk about the bipartisan tone. I feel like that the tone was really one-sided during the first 100 days. The overwhelming coverage was obsessed with the Russia situation. And as it's a story. I'm not going to say that it's not a story. But I think the level of emphasis placed on that story, the amount of details that were coming from specifically from one side, from the Democratic Party, I think that's when you have sort of a frustration. That's why Trump is always on, that's why the president is always on Twitter trying to combat these things, is because how is he expected to move forward on any of these issues when 80% of the coverage is focusing on his campaign's relationship with Russia, which if you, like, the number one source of that kind of reporting is that somehow, you have to somehow believe that the president would purposefully sell out his country to get elected. And I think that a lot of reporters are approaching it from that angle.
But I think it's important to point out there are bipartisan investigations into Russia's meddling of the U.S. election. It's not just Democrats who are investigating it.
And an
Republicans are
FBI
investigating it
investigation.
as well, right?
The other thing is,
Well, and the media is like trying to do the investigating for everybody and trying to, squeeze out every little bit of information about it and highlight it as the number one issue that should be important to Americans. I think a lot of Americans are really frustrated with that.
your line of argument sounds extraordinarily familiar to me. I'm trying to think of where I heard it before. Oh, the emails thing from every single Clinton person I've heard. I'm not saying there's not a point of validity, but suck it up, man. Like, this is the big leagues. It's President of the United States.
I remember during the campaign at one of the Trump events, this nice lady grabs me by the arm and says, "I just wish you guys would cover the Clinton email story."
Right. No, I just mean.
I said, "Ma'am," I said, "let me ask you a question. Where did you hear about the Clinton email story?" "Well, I saw it on the news. I read it in the newspaper." "Okay. Well, then aren't we doing our job, man? We are covering the Clinton email story." And Charlie, I mean, you have to agree. 11 days before the election, the FBI director comes out and says, "Oh, by the way, we're re-examining the Clinton emails." I mean, that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, I think, to some extent. And I think that this story is going to continue to play itself out.
Glenn was making a
Oh, sorry, Glenn.
crescendo here.
No crescendo.
I had to tell my story about this.
It was more of a face plant. No, I think that, look, I think this is the big leagues, man. It's, he got the job. A lot of, you take a lot of slings and arrows. It's also the biggest bully pulpit in the world. And I think one of the real problems is they have diminished the stature of the office, because partially that's how he got elected, was by sort of running down Washington. But when you do that, you deny yourself the tools by which you can amplify your own presence as a president. So he is not capable of transcending these things, A, because of the way that he's dealt with the crisis, but also because you trot out Sean every day and yell at him every night. So, I mean, the parts are wearing down, folks. Devin Nunes courageously or foolishly, depending on your point of view, stepped into the breach and he got obliterated. I mean, anybody who steps forward, Steve Bannon is working. The one thing we can all agree upon, and if you look at him and have seen him in person, the man is working 18-hour days, right? Get a schwitz, dude, Have an ice cream sundae, Like, so people are wearing down. Trump wears people out. So the question is, how can he reload, freshen up, and start using the office of the presidency to move beyond this? Because if there is, let me take you at face value. Let's say there is nothing to this Russian thing, that it's just a series of strange coincidences, right? Which is entirely possible, right? He should be using the tools of the office And part of that, by the way, and this is what I will end on, is understanding the history of the place. You know, it is one thing to come in and break the furniture and say you're going to do it differently, but have a sense of history so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time.
Well, that's right. I mean, he got elected saying he would be the bull in the china shop in Washington, and he's got the bull part down, but is trying to recreate the china shop.
By the way, you should trademark that, though.
Yeah. You got to sell the China at some point, and you got to have something going on. So building it up is the challenge, and we still have 400 plus Senate confirmable seats that have not been nominated.
And he's putting himself at a disadvantage by not filling those jobs. I understand the idea of wanting to make sure that they're his people, wanting to not have to do everything the same way that other administrations have done it, but the government is massive. And as president, you cannot be involved in the details of every decision that's made across the government every single day. You have to have people in place that you trust. And by not filling those jobs, he's putting himself in a weaker position. But I think just broadly, I think one of the things that will be interesting to watch going forward in the Trump White House is, can they get beyond the idea of winning the day and winning the week? Because you're president for 4 years, you get that built in, and you're judged by the culmination of your actions and the culmination of the decisions that you make, not what you made on a Tuesday in April. And I think that if he can get to that point, that will put him in a much more successful position 4 years from now.
Last thing, is it possible for this president, this administration, to succeed, to shoot the gap and actually do big things? Does this panel think that that is possible in this current environment?
I think it's going to take, and I've been thinking about this, you know, it's going to take an act of contrition on his part. I really do. I think that if he were to go public and say, listen, you know, I've made some mistakes, tweets about wiretapping, you know, some of these things were not thought out, I just think that it would do wonders. I think the American people are very forgiving. You know, look at what Ronald Reagan did during the Iran-Contra affair. He came out and apologized to the country and immediately helped himself. Presidents who acknowledge their mistakes, admit the errors of their ways, reap the benefits of that, because the American people are forgiving people, and he was elected. There are a lot of Americans out there who agree with some of what he wants to do, particularly on the economy. And so, you know, I think that he would do a great service to himself. Now, as Glenn said, and I'm trying to remember this during the campaign, I don't think he ever apologized once during the campaign, never really admitted he did anything wrong. There might have been something in that Megyn Kelly interview, if I'm perhaps, where he said something about, you know, retweeting something about Heidi Cruz or something was a mistake. That might be the only thing we ever heard from him during the entire course of the campaign. To me, that would do wonders for him.
Julian?
Yeah, he absolutely can succeed. I think some of it is going to take a little more self-discipline on the part of the White House. Some of it is also going to be out of his control. I mean, don't underestimate the impact of a strong economy and a country that's not engaged in wars, and the reverse of that in 3 years when he's running for re-election. That will have an enormous impact on how people view his presidency, and he can't control all of that.
Charlie?
I think absolutely he can be a success, particularly since he has Republican majorities in all three branches of government. I think, you know,
Who are anxious for a W.
Right. And I think as soon as he can wrangle Congress, you know, his party's in charge of the place. I think that if he can wrangle Congress to get behind some of his agenda that the American people loved, his agenda was very much a bipartisan, pro-America agenda: jobs, fixing the problems with vets, fixing the problems with health care. I think that absolutely Americans can get behind that, and I think he can be a successful president.
Kristen?
I absolutely think he can, and I think part of that process is going to be learning how to get a deal done in real estate and business versus how to get a deal done in Washington, and figuring out who he can work with, who can be potential allies, and who are some of those Democrats who are going to be willing to reach across the aisle and work with him.
There are 12 Senate Democrats up for re-election in states in which he won 82% of the counties in those states or more. Just saying, that is some leverage. Glenn?
Seeing as I made a ton of dumb predictions in 2016, I'm going to make an even dumber one now. And that is, I think, it's going to be, his first term is going to be a tale of two presidencies. I think we're going to be in this period of chaos until the gravitational pull of the 2018 midterms hits us. If history is any guide, they're going to lose some seats. They have a great advantage. But I think it's actually, ironically, I think his presidency is going to follow perhaps Bill Clinton's first term, where I think a midterm erosion of his support, I disagree with Charlie. I think the erosion of his majorities is what's going to make him an interesting president. I think cutting loose of the base that got him elected and doing deals when he has no choice because his majorities are eroded, I think will make for a much more active and interesting presidency.
We will save this tape. Glenn, Kristen, Charlie, Julie, Jim, thank you very much. Ladies and
Thank
gentlemen,
you.
our panel.